No one's allowed to boat or swim in the final 3.2 miles of the Niagara River that feeds into the falls. But back in the day, there was no such restriction. On the evening of July 16th, 1853, 3 men were working on a small barge anchored in the Niagara River about a half-mile away from the edge of the falls. Once they were done with work, the way they would get back to shore is by taking a rowboat and taking it downstream to this small island called Goat Island that sits right on the edge of the falls. Now, in order to get to that island, you would have to traverse the rapids. But it was only a couple hundred feet away, and because they worked here all the time, they had traversed the rapids many times before without incident. But this time, as soon as they got in, one of their oars broke, and so they weren't able to control their boat, and very quickly they got dragged into the rapids, started getting spun around, and then it capsized. Although they desperately tried to swim to shore, the rapids were just too strong, and 2 of the men were swept away to their death. But one man, Joseph Avery, was lucky enough that when he fell in, he drifted down and grabbed onto this tree root that was sticking out of the water. And so he pulled himself about halfway up out of the water, he caught his breath, and he's looking around and he can't believe he survived, but he wasn't out of the water yet, so to speak, because he was in the middle of these rapids and there was nobody on shore. It was getting late. His 2 buddies have drowned, and when he yelled out, the rapids were so loud, nobody could hear him. And the log he was holding onto was totally slick, and so he had to grip it as hard as he could, otherwise he would just slip back into the water. And so all night, with half of his body in the water, he gripped onto this branch as tight as he could and just prayed he would survive. The next morning, when tourists arrived, they noticed Joseph out on this log and they waved to him, and Joseph, who had used all his strength just to hold onto this log all night, was not only fatigued but also was becoming hypothermic, and he very carefully removed one hand and he waved back. The tourists immediately notified authorities and a rescue effort was launched, and because it was too dangerous to take a boat and try to drive down to Avery and pull him out that way because he was right near the edge of the falls, what they did is they went up to this little bridge that was upstream of Joseph, and they released rafts and small boats, hoping that one of them, just by chance, would get caught up on that log and he could grab it, and then Joseph could climb in, throw the rope out, and get pulled to shore. But unfortunately, after dozens of attempts, nothing came close to Joseph. Their next plan was to tie a long tether onto one boat and then guide it down the river until it reached Joseph, and this worked. But when Joseph climbed into the boat, it immediately began to capsize, and witnesses would say Joseph stood up, and as he was falling backwards, he threw his hands up in the air like he was surrendering. He let out a final scream and then fell under the turbulent waters, and then seconds later, he was swept off the falls to his death. Here is the final photo of Joseph Avery. It was taken by a journalist right before that boat with a tether attached to it arrived in front of him. Chad Lawhorn woke up in his Nashville home around 3 a.m. on April 8th, 2018. He pulled out his phone and he saw a notification from his Venmo account. His younger brother, Casey, had sent him $250, and attached to it was a single word note. It just said damages. Knowing his brother had long struggled with his mental health, Chad was concerned he was getting ready to hurt himself, and he had sent him this money as a way to compensate for the emotional toll he was about to inflict on him. Chad didn't even change out of his pajamas. He grabbed his keys, hopped in his car, and began driving the 2 hours to East Ridge, Tennessee, where his younger brother and his mother lived. On the ride there, he called both of them dozens of times, but he never got through. When he finally pulled onto their street, he looked down the road and he saw dozens of police cars and TV crews, and there was yellow crime scene tape all around their property. Chad just stopped the car right in the middle of the road and just stared. And he didn't know how long he was there for, but at some point one of the police officers noticed him and walked up and knocked on his window, and when the officer found out who he was talking to, the news Chad was delivered was far worse than anything he was expecting. 24 hours earlier, Chad's younger brother, Casey, who was 23, was spending the day with one of his very good friends named Avery. They had gone to a comic book store to play Magic the Gathering, and then afterwards they headed back to Casey's house to go to bed. Around 12:30 in the morning, Avery fell asleep on the living room floor, and as Casey was getting ready to go to bed himself, his mother called him and asked if he could come pick her up at the bar. And so Casey begrudgingly agreed to do it. He drove to pick her up, and when he saw her, he could tell she was totally intoxicated, and the entire ride home, she just pleaded with Casey not to hurt himself because it would totally devastate her if he ever did that. Casey hated when she talked to him that way, and apparently she did this all the time. When they got back to the house, Casey dropped his mom off, and then he went up to his bedroom where he retrieved a rifle he had stolen from a friend. And then he paced around his room for a while, getting mentally prepared for what he was about to do. And when he felt ready, he left his room, he went downstairs to the living room where Avery was still asleep on the ground, and he placed the rifle up against the side of his head, and he fired one shot, killing his friend instantly. Once he was dead, Casey went upstairs to his mother's room. When he got to the threshold of her room, he pushed the door open and it was totally dark, but he could tell his mother was still awake awake in her bed. He raised his rifle and he fired, except the gun didn't go off. It jammed. His mother, because she was so intoxicated, did not hear the shot ring out, and she didn't really know what her son was doing in the doorway, so she did not raise any alarms. And so Casey just turned around, walked into the hallway where there was light, he fixed the jam in his gun, he turned back around, and this time his mother was now out of bed because the family dog was barking like mad, and so his mother was trying to calm the dog down, and she looked up and saw her son standing in the doorway carrying a gun, and so she just kind of froze and stared at him, and that's when Casey, without any hesitation, raises his rifle and fires 2 shots, and then his gun jams again. Now, neither of those 2 shots were fatal, although one of them did strike her in the arm. And even though she was intoxicated, she was now fully aware her son is trying to kill her. And so she's screaming at him, "Why are you doing this? You're killing me!" Casey was totally unfazed. He flipped on the lights, he fixed the jam, he re-aimed at his mother, and his mother, who was still just standing next to the bed, looking at her son, wondering why this was happening, and Casey just aimed and took 2 shots, and these would be fatal. After that, he went downstairs and robbed Avery, and then he hopped in his car and he drove all the way to Mississippi, where within 24 hours, he would take his own life. We know all of these details because shortly after he committed these crimes, Casey posted a lengthy confession to Facebook detailing exactly what happened and what he did. Paljor Tawang was offered the opportunity of a lifetime. Born and raised in a valley at the foot of the Himalayas, he was chosen to lead the first ever Indian ascent of the north face of the highest peak in the world, Mount Everest. 12 years after joining the border police, Paljor was an expert climber and very well liked by his peers, making him an obvious candidate for one of the border police's most ambitious missions to date. While Paljor's mother was full of pride for her son's work and accomplishments, he didn't think she would be very supportive if she knew how dangerous the mission he was going on was. And so he told her he was climbing a different mountain, although she would find out through friends where he was actually going, and she would plead with him not to go, but Paljor was not about to change his mind. In May of that year, Paljor said bye to his family, and he and the other hikers set out on their journey. At first, it went extremely well. The weather was perfect, and the men seemed to be having an excellent time. But their luck would not hold. The team's final assault on the north face of Mount Everest was marked by mistakes, bad decisions, and very bad weather. According to the official report on the ascent, those problems started on the morning of May 10th when Paljor and the other 3 climbers woke up late. Instead of leaving base camp at 3:30 a.m. like they were planning to, they didn't leave until 8 a.m., so 4.5 hours late. Making matters worse, the weather continued to deteriorate with a blizzard moving in, creating near zero visibility. But even under the best of circumstances, Mount Everest is still a force of nature. The summit may be covered in colorful ropes and flags and climbers with their high-tech, shiny, beautiful gear, accompanied by a small army of Sherpas, but the outward appearance of commercialization is deceptive. Since 1924, at least 300 people have died on Mount Everest. The death-to-summit ratio is a staggering 4%. The extremely high altitude, Everest reaches 5.5 miles into the sky, not only makes physical exertion extremely difficult, it affects your judgment and decision-making, and not in a good way. Climbers and scientists have a name for the final half mile of Mount Everest. It's called the death zone, because literally, while you're up there, you're dying. Oxygen is so limited up there that your cells just begin to die, and extremely fit people will have heart attacks and strokes and experience debilitating altitude sickness. The conditions are so severe that people have died from exhaustion just standing in line waiting to reach the summit. But one of the biggest killers in the death zone is something called summit fever. When you get to that point in the climb, you are so close to reaching your goal. People will disregard safety and keep going on when really they should turn around and go back. Paljor and his 3 teammates were given strict orders to turn around at 3 p.m. if they had not reached the summit yet. But because of their late start, when 3 p.m. rolled around, they were not at the summit, they were in the death zone. One of the climbers who was with Paljor was the commander, and so at 3 p.m. when they were supposed to stop and turn around, he was at the very back of the climbing stack. And so he stopped and he yelled up to Paljor and the others and tried to get them to stop too so they could go back down, but either they didn't hear him or they just ignored him. Already suffering from frostbite and totally exhausted, he could not go any farther, so he grabbed his radio and he tried to hail them to tell them to stop and come back, but they didn't pick up their radio. And so the commander, after waiting for a few minutes, knew he had to go back down, and so he turned and began the descent. About 30 minutes later, the commander's radio crackled on again, and it was Paljor and the others, and they were informing him that they were going to make a push for the summit. They were about an hour away. And the commander said, "Stop, turn around, I'm ordering you to come back down. The weather is only getting worse." But whether they were suffering from summit fever or overconfidence, we don't know. But regardless, they refused. Frustrated and terrified for the other climbers, the commander just continued down the mountain. But 2.5 hours later, his radio crackled again, and this time it was Paljor and the others saying they had made it. They were standing on the summit of Mount Everest. The men had not just set a record for India, they had brought immeasurable honor to their country. The news sparked a huge celebration down in the base camp and also in the city of Leh, which is where the border police were located. But the party atmosphere would not last long. Shortly after the victory call, the weather turned from bad to horrible. What would later be known as the blizzard of 1996 had arrived in full fury, and by midnight that night, no one had heard from Paljol or the other 2 people he was with. And just a couple of days later, rescue climbers would confirm all 3 men had died. In the years following Paljol's death on the north face of Mount Everest, this hopeful and proud young Indian has become a sort of gruesome celebrity and landmark for the thousands of climbers that make it up into the death zone. Except now he's widely known on the internet and amongst people who are passionate about climbing the world's highest peak, not as Paljor, one of the first Indians to climb the north face of Mount Everest, but as Green Boots, which is a reference to the bright neon green boots he was wearing when he died. For more than 20 years, he's laid near the top of Mount Everest in a small limestone cave, wearing an orange parka and blue pants, and he's curled on his side with his arms wrapped around him like he's trying to keep himself warm. Since his death, anyone climbing the north face when the snow cover is light would literally have to step over his body to get to the top. But Paljor is not the only dead body on Mount Everest. There are over 200 other dead climbers littering the slopes of the world's highest peak. It's just too dangerous and too expensive to try to get them down, and so they stay wherever they died. Which means if you climb Mount Everest, you will literally be climbing over dead bodies on your way to the summit. But of all the bodies on Mount Everest, the most famous by far is Paljor. Here is an image of Paljor, aka Green Boots.